What truth did Ann-Margret keep hidden for decades about her deep connection with Elvis Presley? Now, at 84, she finally opens her heart, revealing untold stories of love, loyalty, and the private bond that shaped both of their lives. These long-guarded memories uncover the passion, the promises, and the struggles that no one else ever witnessed. Stay with us as we reveal the truth Ann-Margret has carried all these years. When two stars collided. In the spring of 1963, Hollywood felt like it was holding its breath. Elvis Presley was still the reigning king of rock and roll, though the film studios were pulling him deeper into a world of sound stages, carefully controlled scripts, and light-hearted musicals that often frustrated him. Ann-Margret, on the other hand, was the dazzling newcomer, the fiery-haired starlet, whose explosive dance numbers and striking screen presence had critics hailing her as the female Elvis. When the two finally crossed paths on the set of Viva Las Vegas, it was as though the entertainment industry's favorite prophecy had come to life. A mirror image of the king had walked into his world, and the effect was immediate. From the first table read, those in the room felt something shift. Elvis, who was known to be playful but sometimes reserved with co-stars, leaned in more closely than usual. He watched Ann-Margret intently as she read her lines, as though he were listening to music rather than dialogue. She, in turn, carried herself with a mixture of confidence and warmth that set her apart from the long line of women who had stood beside him in films before. There was no sense of intimidation, no hesitation in her delivery. Instead, she matched his energy beat for beat, creating a rhythm that felt less like acting and more like two performers improvising a private duet. The crew whispered about it almost instantly. Something about their chemistry seemed unscripted. Even in early rehearsals, when the two danced in simple practice clothes, there was an electricity that no camera could contain. Stagehands paused longer than usual at the edges of the set, watching movements that looked like flirtation wrapped in choreography. Their laughter carried across the soundstage, unforced and unguarded. It wasn't just that they were in sync, one crew member would later recall. It was that they seemed to forget anyone else was in the room. That aura spilled over into their work. When filming began in earnest, the director quickly realized he had struck gold. The dance sequences between Elvis and Ann-Margret required little correction. They moved as if pulled by the same invisible tempo, each anticipating the other's next move with uncanny precision. Camera operators noticed that neither needed much rehearsal to find the right angles. What audiences would later see as carefully choreographed magic was, in truth, a natural extension of how the two interacted when the cameras weren't rolling. For Elvis, who had spent years working alongside co-stars chosen to flatter rather than challenge him, the experience was invigorating. Ann-Margret didn't just keep up with him, she pushed him, teased him, and raised the stakes in every scene. He seemed more alive on set, more willing to experiment with his lines and throw himself fully into the musical numbers. Ann-Margret brought out a side of him that had grown dormant under the pressure of repetitive scripts and an increasingly stifling image. The press at the time could sense the spark too. When stills from the set began circulating, journalists remarked on how natural the two looked together. Fan magazines speculated breathlessly about whether the chemistry was real or a clever publicity stunt. But those inside the studio knew there was no staging involved. When Elvis and Ann-Margret locked eyes, there was a charge that could not be faked. Hollywood had seen countless on-screen romances, but this was something different. This was two stars meeting at the precise moment when their careers, their personas, and their personal lives intersected in a way neither could have planned. For Elvis, it was a rare chance to step outside of the gilded cage built around him by managers and studios. For Ann-Margret, it was her moment to prove she could hold her own, not just with the most famous entertainer in the world, but with the man himself. If their first meeting had the energy of destiny, what would happen once the lights dimmed and the studio doors closed? Stay with us to uncover the details. Stolen Nights on the Strip. The curtain call always marked the end for the audience, but for Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret, it was often the beginning. While fans rushed out of theaters humming songs from Viva Las Vegas and tabloids buzzed with speculation, a quieter, more intoxicating story unfolded away from flashing bulbs and studio walls. Their connection did not burn brightest under the glare of the cameras, but in the unguarded hours when the Strip softened and the desert night offered cover. In Las Vegas, where excess was a way of life, their time together took on its own secret rhythm. Elvis was no stranger to the city's allure, but he had grown weary of the constant demands that came with being recognized. Ann-Margret, though newer to fame, understood the same strain. Together they discovered a freedom in escaping the spotlight rather than basking in it. Hotel suites became sanctuaries, with thick drapes pulled tight against neon signs, and the laughter that echoed inside was theirs alone. There were motorcycles, of course. Elvis's love of engines was well known, but it was Ann-Margret who surprised him with her willingness to ride. She clung to him not out of fear, but exhilaration, sharing his passion for speed and the rush of the open road. In those late-night rides beyond the Strip, where desert winds whipped past and the stars stretched endlessly overhead, the trappings of their celebrity lives seemed to dissolve. Out there, they weren't icons or headlines. They were just two people chasing the thrill of being untethered. The nights were not all adrenaline. They often carried a quieter intimacy, too. Both were known for their energy on stage, but away from audiences, they revealed gentler sides. Elvis would sit at a piano and play not for a crowd, but for Ann-Margret alone, choosing gospel tunes or half-finished ballads that had never left his notebooks. She, in turn, would dance in the living room of a suite with no choreography, her movements playful and unstructured, meant only to amuse him. These private performances were unrecorded, unseen, and perhaps more honest than anything the public adored. The secrecy was deliberate. Friends who saw them together understood they were witnessing something fragile and unspoken. Few dared to intrude. There was an unspoken rule among those in their inner circle. Whatever passed between Elvis and Ann-Margret was theirs to guard. At a time when gossip columns could devour reputations overnight, that silence was as rare as it was valuable. They developed rituals that stitched their hidden world together. Elvis often sent flowers, extravagant arrangements that arrived without fanfare. Ann-Margret kept them tucked away, avoiding questions but treasuring the gesture. She responded in her own way, sometimes with handwritten notes folded carefully into envelopes that carried more meaning than entire interviews could. Those messages, written in her looping script, were kept out of public sight, but their words lingered with him long after. There was also a certain recklessness, born of knowing how quickly such moments could vanish. They slipped away to lounges disguised in plain clothes, though the disguise was never quite enough to erase the aura surrounding Elvis. Ann-Margret played her role well, guiding him with practiced subtlety, turning attention away when necessary, and offering the normalcy he craved. Together they carved out pockets of privacy even in the most public city in the world. Yet beneath the glow of these stolen nights was a tension they could never ignore. Both knew the boundaries of their lives. Elvis was tethered to expectations at Graceland, and Ann-Margret was at the dawn of a career she had fought to claim. Their time together was a rebellion against those boundaries, a chance to live as they wanted rather than as they were told. It was intoxicating precisely because it was fleeting, each night carrying the weight of what it defied. Those who caught glimpses of them during these stolen hours remembered the sense of inevitability. It wasn't just attraction. It was two people drawn together by the same hunger for freedom, the same need to step outside of roles the world had written for them. For Elvis, Ann-Margret was not just a co-star, but an accomplice in escape. For her, he was not just the king of rock and roll, but a man who, in the quietest hours, seemed almost ordinary in his longing. As the Strip glittered and the desert stretched endlessly beyond it, their story deepened in ways few could grasp. These nights were not for cameras, not for contracts, and not for the fans who adored them both. They belonged solely to the two who lived them, a secret shared in stolen hours that shaped everything that would follow. But secrets in love rarely remain untouched. What happens when the walls of Graceland whisper and the reality of another woman's presence begins to shadow the affair? Stay here as we reveal everything. Priscilla's quiet hurt. Life at Graceland was rarely as idyllic as the photographs suggested. While the gates stood as symbols of devotion from adoring fans, inside them, silence often carried more weight than music. For Priscilla Presley, the sprawling mansion could feel less like a home and more like a gilded cage, filled with the echoes of expectations she had not chosen for herself. She had given up her teenage years to follow Elvis, building her identity around him. But as whispers about Ann-Margret began to trickle in, the foundation she had carefully balanced her life upon began to crack. Unlike the outside world, Priscilla did not need magazines or tabloids to feed her suspicion. She saw the evidence in subtler ways. A sudden change in Elvis's mood, the way he lingered over certain phone calls, the hours that stretched longer without explanation. Rumors carried by insiders or small mentions in Hollywood columns only confirmed what she had already sensed. Someone else occupied part of his heart. That someone wasn't just another name in passing. It was Ann-Margret, a woman whose image filled movie screens and whose talent seemed to mirror his own. The hurt went deeper than jealousy. For Priscilla, Ann-Margret represented not only competition, but a reflection of everything she herself was not. Ann-Margret was public, vibrant, and adored for her independence on stage. Priscilla, in contrast, had been groomed to remain in the background, supporting Elvis's world rather than building her own. Watching his relationship with a woman who matched him in energy and fame underscored the sacrifices she had made. It wasn't simply the threat of losing him, it was the realization that she had never been allowed the chance to stand as his equal. At Graceland, arguments rose quietly, rarely erupting into full confrontations, but leaving behind long stretches of coldness. Elvis, accustomed to compartmentalizing his life, tried to brush off concerns, but Priscilla was not easily consoled. She noticed the flowers that arrived at the house with no clear explanation, the vague stories of work that kept him away longer than expected, and the guarded tone he sometimes used when she asked questions. Friends who visited the mansion often described the atmosphere as strained. While the house bustled with staff, bodyguards, and relatives, Priscilla seemed increasingly isolated. The opulence around her did little to ease the sense of displacement. For all its grand halls and ornate decor, Graceland could feel unbearably lonely when Elvis was elsewhere, emotionally, if not physically. The irony was painful. She lived in the home every fan dreamed of, yet its walls often felt like barriers keeping her apart from the man she loved. Letters became her private outlet. Though she rarely expressed her deepest pain aloud, she confided in writing. Some notes hinted at longing, others at quiet accusations, but most revealed the unshakable truth that she was struggling to hold together a relationship that often seemed larger than her own life. She knew the public would never see this side of Elvis, the private partner who could be distant, unpredictable, and at times unreachable. The image of perfection sold to fans came at the expense of her silence. As the affair between Elvis and Ann-Margret continued to linger in the background, Priscilla found herself constantly calculating her position. Walking away was unthinkable. She had invested her youth, her identity, and her future in him. But staying meant enduring a role she had not fully chosen, the quiet wife-to-be, maintaining appearances while knowing her rival was both celebrated on screen and treasured in private. It was in this tension that Priscilla's quiet hurt grew heavier. She was not the type to confront the world with her grievances, but those who knew her at the time recalled the shift in her demeanor. Her laughter was less frequent, her presence more subdued. It wasn't dramatic heartbreak. It was the slow erosion of certainty, the feeling of being displaced in her own story. The cruelest twist was that she could never fully escape the comparisons. While she lived behind the gates of Graceland, Ann-Margret shone across cinema screens, her energy admired by millions. For Priscilla, Every poster and magazine cover was a reminder of what Elvis had found elsewhere, a reminder she could never entirely escape. Still, she endured. Out of loyalty, fear, or perhaps love itself, she held her place at his side. Yet deep down she understood that the image of Elvis as a devoted partner was crumbling. What she could not yet know was how much longer the cracks would widen, and what the cost would be once they could no longer be hidden. How long can silence shield a secret before it begins to demand a voice of its own? Come along as we uncover the hidden story. Why silence became sacred. In Hollywood, secrets rarely stay buried. Whispers travel faster than headlines, and even the most guarded stars eventually see their private lives laid bare in ink. Yet for decades, Ann-Margret kept her lips sealed about her connection with Elvis Presley. Unlike so many others who capitalized on proximity to the king, she chose silence. And that silence was not born from fear, but from loyalty. At a time when exposing him could have earned her wealth, attention, and notoriety, she guarded his story as carefully as her own. Part of that choice was rooted in respect. Ann-Margret had seen firsthand how easily Elvis's life could be distorted by the public. Fans devoured every rumor, twisting fragments of truth into exaggerated tales. To share the details of their private bond would have meant feeding that same machine, reducing something meaningful to tabloid fodder. For her, the affair was not a publicity stunt or a stepping stone. It was an experience she valued enough to shield from exploitation. Hollywood in the 1960s was a place of careful image management. Studios invested heavily in the reputations of their stars, knowing that a scandal could ruin more than a single career. Elvis was not just an actor, but a global phenomenon, whose popularity stretched far beyond the box office. Any hint of infidelity threatened not only his standing with fans, but also the carefully polished image his management worked tirelessly to preserve. Ann-Margret, wise beyond her years, understood that to betray his confidence would be to dismantle the very foundation of his empire. There was also the matter of timing. Ann-Margret was ascending rapidly in her own right, and controversy could have jeopardized her momentum. Yet she never sought to build her fame on Elvis's name. Reporters tried to corner her with leading questions, but she deflected them with grace, giving answers that revealed nothing while preserving her dignity. To many, her silence seemed like evasion, but for those who knew her, it was an act of devotion, an acknowledgement that some truths were not meant for public consumption. The depth of her discretion revealed itself most clearly after Elvis's death. As publishers rushed to cash in on sensational stories, Ann-Margret remained steadfast. She refused lucrative offers to pen tell-all memoirs or sit for confessional interviews. For her, protecting his memory was more important than adding to her own legacy. In a world where almost everyone around him seemed eager to sell a piece of his life, she became one of the few who would not. That silence was its own kind of testimony. It spoke of promises made in private, moments shared without the expectation of recognition, and a bond that did not need validation from the outside world. While others might measure the worth of a relationship by its public acknowledgement, Ann-Margret measured it by the care with which it was preserved. She once hinted that loyalty was the greatest gift she could offer, and by keeping her silence, she proved those words true. The loyalty did not go unnoticed. Elvis himself acknowledged her steadfastness in ways that only deepened her resolve. He trusted her, not only as a confidant, but as someone who would not betray the tenderness they had built together. That trust created a sanctuary where he could be vulnerable, free from the demands of his role as a public figure. Ann-Margret's silence wasn't merely protection of his reputation. It was protection of the fragile humanity that few ever got to see. It is worth remembering how rare that kind of discretion was. Many of Elvis's companions, however briefly connected to him, later shared their stories for profit. Each book, article, or documentary added to a growing mythology that sometimes strayed far from truth. In contrast, Ann-Margret's restraint became almost legendary in itself. She proved that devotion could outlast even temptation, and that sometimes love is measured not by what is said, but by what is kept unsaid. Her silence endured for decades, becoming part of the fabric of their story. Only now, with the distance of age and the wisdom that comes with it, has she begun to acknowledge the depth of her feelings more openly. Even then, her words are not sensational or self-serving. They are measured, tender, and offered with the same sense of reverence that has defined her stance all along. Yet silence, however protective, cannot erase memory. As Ann-Margret kept her vow, she also carried the weight of knowing what the world did not. And in the space between what was revealed and what remained hidden, the true shape of their bond quietly endured. But when secrecy becomes the language of love, how do two people sustain a connection once the passion itself begins to change form? Come with us to see what lies ahead. Mirrors and letters. The end of an affair does not always mark the end of a connection. For Elvis Presley and Ann-Margret, the fire of romance eventually settled into something quieter, yet equally enduring. While passion faded under the weight of circumstance, their bond did not vanish. Instead, it shifted, transforming into a friendship that spanned years and crossed the distance of separate lives. That friendship revealed itself in small, enduring rituals. When Elvis sent flowers, it was not simply a romantic gesture, but a reminder that he still thought of her. Ann-Margret received them often, sometimes with notes, sometimes without, and always with an understanding that they carried meaning only she could interpret. In turn, she responded not through public displays but through private words. Letters flowed between them, short, personal messages that spoke less of grand declarations and more of familiarity, comfort, and trust. These exchanges were not the feverish confessions of young lovers. They carried the tone of two people who had once known each other deeply and who refused to let that intimacy disappear. The language was careful, never indulgent, but always warm. Elvis trusted Ann-Margret with thoughts he did not share freely with others. In his letters, he revealed vulnerabilities that rarely appeared in his performances or interviews. Ann-Margret, for her part, answered with steadiness, offering encouragement and compassion without judgment. Phone calls became another thread binding them. Sometimes brief, sometimes lingering late into the night, they allowed Elvis and Ann-Margret to reconnect across the miles that separated their daily lives. These conversations were not dramatic, they were human. He could speak freely, dropping the veneer of the king, and she could listen without expectation. For Ann-Margret, hearing his voice was less about rekindling the past and more about preserving the person she had once known. Their friendship was unusual in its endurance. Hollywood romances often ended with bitterness or silence, but theirs turned into something rare, mutual respect that survived the collapse of passion. Even as each moved forward, Elvis with his complicated marriage, Ann-Margret with her growing career and eventual husband, they found space to maintain a quiet line of communication. They did not need to see each other constantly. The knowledge of each other's presence was enough. When tragedy eventually struck, that bond revealed itself most clearly. In 1977, as news of Elvis's death stunned the world, Ann-Margret mourned not as a fan or a former lover, but as someone who had shared a private chapter of his life. She did not rush to the press with stories, or to the public with tears. Instead, she grieved quietly, honoring the man rather than the myth. Attending his funeral, she carried herself with the same discretion that had defined her all along, her presence speaking more than any words could have. For Ann-Margret, keeping their friendship alive was never about nostalgia. It was about honoring what had once been real and ensuring it remained untouched by exploitation. For Elvis, having her in his life meant knowing at least one person would never betray his trust. That balance gave them both a kind of stability they could not always find elsewhere. But loyalty can be both a gift and a burden. What happens when a friend watches the steady decline of someone they once loved, unable to stop the unraveling? Stay with us to know what really happened. Watching a legend unravel. The Elvis Presley the world adored in the late 1960s was a man reborn. The triumphant comeback special in 1968 reminded audiences of the raw energy that had first catapulted him to fame. But for those who remained close to him, the years that followed painted a different picture. one of brilliance dimming under the weight of exhaustion, dependency, and the relentless grind of performance. Ann-Margret witnessed this unraveling from a distance that was close enough to wound but far enough to leave her powerless. Reports reached her through friends, glimpses of a man trapped in a cycle of tours that never seemed to end. Each dazzling performance in rhinestone-studded jumpsuits concealed a growing fragility. The cheers of thousands masked the fact that his health, spirit, and peace of mind were eroding. What unsettled Ann-Margret most was how the very people meant to protect Elvis often became part of his decline. The entourage that surrounded him acted less like guardians and more like gatekeepers. Pills became a constant presence, prescribed and distributed with alarming ease, and his isolation grew thicker with every passing year. For those who loved him privately, watching from the sidelines was a helpless ache. Elvis's public image remained larger than life, but the man beneath it was increasingly elusive. Ann-Margret, who had once known his laughter in unguarded moments, now heard stories of mood swings, erratic habits, and late nights that left him hollow by morning. It was not the king she remembered, but a shadow fighting to keep pace with the legend the world demanded him to be. The tragedy was that his decline was not sudden. It unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it became impossible to ignore. Ann-Margret carried the sorrow of knowing she had seen him at his most alive, his most vibrant, and now had to bear witness to a transformation that felt inevitable yet unbearable. As sequins glittered under stage lights, the shadow behind them deepened. And for Ann-Margret, the weight of memory only sharpened the heartbreak of watching greatness unravel before her eyes. What happens when age and memory finally strip away the glitter, leaving only the truth behind? Let us take you through the secrets. The confession that honors. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest edges of memory. For Ann-Margret, reaching her 80s brought not only the wisdom of survival, but also the freedom to finally unburden her heart. At 84, she no longer speaks with the hesitation of a young actress guarding her career or the discretion of a woman protecting a lover's reputation. Instead, she speaks with tenderness, offering the truth not as scandal, but as remembrance. Her confession does not arrive wrapped in sensationalism. It is quiet, deliberate, and shaped by love. She admits that Elvis was more than a co-star, more than a fleeting romance. He was the man who lit a fire in her life at a time when everything felt possible. Their connection, she explains, was not perfect, but it was real, filled with laughter, passion, and the kind of unspoken understanding that survives long after the moment itself has passed. She does not dwell on mistakes or regrets. Instead, she emphasizes gratitude. To her, those months of intensity were a gift, a rare intersection of fate that left its imprint on both their lives. Even as decades rolled on and each found separate paths, the bond remained, not as scandalous history, but as a piece of her soul that never dimmed. What stands out most in her words is respect. Ann-Margret has no interest in tarnishing Elvis's image, nor does she exaggerate their closeness. She offers her truth as a way of honoring him, as a man who struggled, loved, and sought comfort in rare moments of trust. In doing so, she reminds the world that behind the legend was a person, flawed yet unforgettable, who had touched her life in a way she would never forget. At 84, her honesty feels less like revelation and more like closure. By speaking openly, she frees herself from the weight of decades of silence while preserving the dignity of what they shared. Her truth is not for gossip, but for memory, ensuring that the story is told not by those who sought profit, but by the one who lived it with him. Which part of Ann-Margret's truth touched you the most? Was it the electric spark she shared with Elvis, the silent loyalty she kept for decades, or the heartfelt way she still honors him today? Share your thoughts in the comments below.